Okay, we have to talk about this. I miss the Back to the Future ride more than I miss some members of my own family. It's no secret that Back to the Future is my favorite film trilogy, and the ride was delightful, featuring all of the action and comedy you'd expect from the franchise, and Christopher Lloyd and Tom Wilson doing what they do best. Frankly, after everything he's been through, I was just happy to see Doc as a successful, renowned scientist, with his own institute giving tours, which again kinda fits with the Expo theme if you squint at it. But alas, everything I fall in love with must eventually break up with me and file a restraining order before mysteriously vanishing off the face of the earth, and Back to the Future the ride was no exception. I bought this shirt at this gift shop. I mean, it didn't look like this back then. It was just Back to the Future the store, which I guess isn't really a very interesting theme for a store. I mean, it's interesting content-wise, but it doesn't really make any sense from an aesthetic standpoint. It's like, there's nothing in-universe it could have been. Well, no, they should have made it the antique shop. That's what they should have done for the theme. Why didn't they ask me back when they were designing? That's not the point. The point is now this shirt actually is an antique. I mean, you can't get this in there anymore. It's just Simpsons stuff. And it's cool that there's Simpsons stuff, but I miss the Back to the Future stuff. I mean, I have a picture of me and my buddy Larry in front of that store back when the DeLorean was in front of there with Doc Brown, and it was like the highlight of my high school senior trip. I mean, Larry, back me up on this one.
Dave, what have I told you about calling me with your existential crises?
They can't be theme park related?
They can't be theme park related!
Why is it gone? Why did the Institute of Future Technology have to close? These questions were eating at me, so I decided to ask the only man who would know the answer.
Well, what happened was too many people were getting off the experiment before it came to a complete stop, and thereby falling through the time-space continuum. And then I'd have to find them somewhere between 10 and 150,000 years in the past or the future. You can see why this became a problem. You guys should have had flying cars by now, not to mention helicopters.
Yeah, Doc's still here. And he rides a bike with a flux capacitor. That must be a bitch to get up to 88. And Universal still shows Back to the Future some love. The theme music still plays in Production Central, the DeLorean and train are still here, there's still some merchandise, clips show up in montages in the parks. They just no longer show it a ride's worth of love. But if it had to go, well, at least its replacement made a whole lot more sense than Twister. The Simpsons ride is an excellent and essential addition to the theme park industry. I just wish we didn't have to lose Back to the Future for it, especially when there's a perfectly bulldozable Shrek a few blocks away. But at least they included the ride film and the pre-show on all subsequent DVD and Blu-ray releases, so I can always recreate the experience at home. It's like I'm really 30 years in the future, in 2015. I think I'm getting motion sickness. Screw it. Next time, we are looking at the kid stuff. And my number one favorite villain in comedy, Biff Tannen from the Back to the Future trilogy. Yes, I know at one point he was evicted by someone lower on this list, but for me, he's still number one. The very funny but very scary Biff Tannen, played by the very funny and very friendly Tom Wilson, seems to have nothing better to do than to terrorize George McFly and harass Lorraine Baines well into adulthood. Like many bullies, Biff isn't the brightest gigawatt in the lightning bolt, and his lack of smarts leads to some endlessly quotable one-liners. With all due respect to Don't Call Me Shirley, the funniest line of dialogue in cinema history will always be,
"So why don't you make like a tree and get out of here?"
But he doesn't need intelligence to be physically imposing. Indeed, his inability to think things through leads to a recklessness that is unquestionably threatening, not to mention a complete lack of respect for sexual boundaries. Yeah, that's still really, really evil. Yes, he's cowardly when his power is taken away from him, but when he's at the top of the food chain, or even just out of earshot of the people who scare him, there's no telling what he'll do to the people he decides to hate. And the whole Tannen family has a few screws loose. Biff's grandson Griff is even more cartoony with his cybernetic implants, but his goofy voice is also unsettling.
Since when did you become the physical type?
His great-grandfather Buford Mad Dog Tannen has some of the funniest bits in the whole trilogy.
Like I said, we'll finish this tomorrow.
Tomorrow we're robbing the Pan City stage.
What about Monday? We doing anything Monday?
No, Monday be fine. You can kill him on Monday.
I'll be back this way on Monday.
But he also murdered Doc Brown. And possibly Marshall Strickland, if deleted scenes are canon. Once again, the same things that make Biff funny in one scene also make him dangerous in the next, so the tone can shift gears without losing either important facet. It makes for a delightfully despicable villain we love to hate throughout the whole trilogy. Hey everyone, Dave here, and right now I'm geeking out over the fact that we're in the future!
Dave's Obsession! Dave's Obsession of the moment!
That's right, buttheads. Dry your jackets and pull out your pants pockets because we are finally actually approaching the actual date that Marty McFly arrived in the future. Unless you're watching this on YouTube, in which case we just passed that date, as well as the 60th anniversary of the discovery of time travel, but we are rapidly approaching the 60th anniversary of the Hill Valley lightning storm. But if you're watching this video on its original Geek Vision release date, then Marty and Doc's arrival is imminent, which will hopefully put a stop to all those fake dates that keep going viral for increasingly stupid reasons. And it hopefully means that California is getting some rain soon. And what better way to celebrate our favorite non-British, non-surfer dude, non-canine time-traveling duo's arrival than with a look back at the movie that gave us our first glimpse in October 2015, Back to the Future Part 2, a movie I adore with all my heart. Now, of course, it's silly to call an entry in one of the most successful and enduring trilogies of all time underrated, but I do think Back to the Future Part 2 is underappreciated as a sequel. Because Back to the Future Part 2 might be one of the first ever sequels about sequels, and it might still be one of the funniest, with all due respect to 22 Jump Street, of course.
Do the same thing as last time. Everyone's happy.
In the same way that much of the plot of 22 Jump Street is the people in charge want us to redo the first movie, much of the plot of Back to the Future Part 2 is literally we need to go back to the first movie. It's a Back to the Future sequel all about people's expectations for a Back to the Future sequel, where the characters go back to revisit all the classic scenes from the first film, just like people think they want sequels to do. But Dave, why are you calling this a self-aware homage to repetitive sequelitis instead of just a victim of repetitive sequelitis? Well, I admit it can be a fine line. But self-awareness has always been part of Back to the Future's DNA. The first movie had fun playing with the tropes of all sorts of genres, from sci-fi to romantic comedies, and the second movie picks up right where it left off. Such as this classic scene.
When are you gonna get it through your thick skull, Lorraine? You're my girl.
Biff Tannen, I wouldn't be your girl even if you had $1 million.
Everything about this scene, from the dialogue to the performances to the camera work, treats it like it's the ominous setup to a later payoff. You know, the sort of thing Edgar Wright likes doing in the first act of his films.
We'll have a Bloody Mary first thing. Have a bite of the King's Head, couple of the Little Princess. We'll stagger back here. Back at the bar for shots.
It's just that in this case, it's an hour into the movie, and it's foreshadowing something that we already saw happen.
I'm gonna marry you someday, Lorraine! Someday you'll be my wife!
Of course, earlier on there was some actual thematic foreshadowing, actually involving the playing with the tropes, when the movie gives us the most meta joke in the entire trilogy.
Excuse the disguise, Marty, but I was afraid you wouldn't recognize me. I went to a rejuvenation clinic and got a whole natural overhaul. They took out some wrinkles, did a hair repair, change of blood, added a good 30 to 40 years to my life. They also replaced my spleen and colon. What do you think?
You look great, Doc.
Now, the practical reason this bit is here is so that they wouldn't have to put older Doc makeup on Chris Lloyd for every single scene in the movie. But Marty's reaction shows that he barely even notices a difference. And truth be told, it took me years before I even noticed that Doc was wearing old age makeup in the 1985 scenes in the first movie. It's a gag born out of necessity, and yet the entire joke here is acknowledging that the audience didn't even realize it was necessary. And that sentence is still one of the least confusing things about this movie. That scene foreshadows the fact that this movie is going to be about itself on some level, and it's soon followed by another scene that foreshadows the movie's take on sequelitis by evoking and then subverting an iconic scene from the first movie.
Look, I need to borrow your hoverboard.
And yes, a lame, unimaginative sequel would also revel in redoing scenes from the first movie, but what separates this from a dull, boring, repetitive sequel is that only the surface level details are repeated. Yes, at a very casual glance, the hoverboard chase is a retread of the skateboard chase from the first movie, but the scene plays out completely differently. In the first movie, the skateboard chase is a swashbuckling hijink where Marty is at an advantage because he's the only one who knows how a skateboard works, because He's the one from the future. He has the element of surprise, and Biff and the gang have no idea what to do with him, other than try to outmuscle him, which does not work so well for them. In the second movie, the cocky young Marty goes into the hoverboard chase thinking he has the same advantage, but he's the only one who doesn't know how hoverboards work because he's the one not from the future.
Football's don't work on water unless you've got power!
And the differences are cemented with the kids' reactions to the proceedings. 50s kid may be impressed with his new skateboard, but a Mattel hoverboard is not cooler than a pit bull. Biff may find something very familiar about all this, but really, the only thing that's the same about the scenes are the music and the setup where Marty rips the handlebars off of something to escape a Tannen gang. Of course, if Marty came to the real 2015, he'd rip the handlebars off a Segway and make whatever that is. And that scene is no fluke. Nearly every time something from the first movie is repeated, the second movie ups the stake and changes the context. Very little is repeated for the sake of repetition, unless that repetition is there to set up a later subversion. This isn't some Shanghai Nights where they just redo the same scenes from the first movie in an attempt to get the same laugh as the first movie. When 1985 Biff tells Marty, "Say hi to your mom for me," he's exerting his dominance over the McFlys. But when 2015 Biff tells Marty Jr., "Say hi to your grandma for me," he's impotently trying to tease the McFlys despite being stuck in the distant past. The Johnny Be Good scene is a victory lap in the first movie. Here it's still a tense race where one wrong move on the second Marty's part could spell disaster. Conversely, Doc's high wire act on the clock tower is a victory lap in this movie. George punching Biff is a conflict resolution in both movies, but the same punch serves as two very different solutions to two very different problems. Even something as simple as the song Mr. Sandman is used to show Marty's discomfort in the 50s in the first movie and his familiarity with the 50s in the second one. The closest the scene comes to merely serving a repeated function is Leah Thompson waking up Marty, which at least also serves as the second entry in a Rule of Three gag. I guess the manure also serves a similar function as it did in the first movie, but the joke is escalated because he just got done cleaning that damn car. Oh, Biff, you rapscallion.
I hate manure!
Okay, so Back to the Future 2 might not be a straight-up parody of sequels the way 22 Jump Street is, but it's still a movie that has a blast taking the expectations of sequels to their most literal manifestations, and then experimenting with how to twist them around. It's a movie where changing things too much from the first movie is disastrous, but sticking too close to the first movie is also dangerous, allowing it to have its Pepsi Perfect and drink it too. It's a movie that delights in its own self-indulgence and its own self-subversion almost as much as it delights in its own self-convolution. It's also the movie that has the most fun with time travel itself. I mean, it's the only film in the trilogy where going back in time is actually a solution to a problem rather than the cause of all the problems. And it's also the first movie where we really get a good arc for Marty. I mean, Marty had a bit of an arc in the first movie where he's on his way to mail his record to a record company or however that worked in the 80s, but the first movie was really George's arc, and the second movie sets up Marty's arc, which is completed in part 3, and it's actually an interesting reversal of George's arc, where George's arc is solved through confrontation, but okay, I'm getting sidetracked. I could talk about these movies for hours, and I'm sure I will. No doubt in the future you'll see several more videos from me about this trilogy. There's a lot to discuss here. People have been discussing these movies for the past 30 years, and we're still discovering new things about them. Of course, not everyone who discusses the movies enjoys them as much as I do, which is fine, you know, everybody has their own taste. But over my years of discussing this trilogy, I keep hearing people bring up flaws with it that aren't actually flaws, and in fact are kind of stupid. And we're going to be discussing some of those next time. Until then, this is Dave, signing off. Welcome to the D-List, the show where I list things and my name begins with a D. A DeLorean? You know what's even stupider than that joke? Some of the nitpicks people make about Back to the Future. Look, I'm not going to claim the movies are flawless. I might think it really loudly, but I acknowledge that everything made by humans has human error. But over the years, I've seen lots of people complain about certain plot holes in the trilogy that just aren't plot holes at all. Like, all you have to do is think about them for 2 seconds and you realize, oh, that actually does make sense in the movies. I don't know if it's the convoluted nature of the films that makes people want to poke holes in them, but lots of people keep trying to dig up dirt that doesn't exist. And I'm not saying there are necessarily 0 plot holes in the movie, I'm just saying a lot of the ones that people bring up frequently are not plot holes. Some of these nitpicks are explained away in the movies themselves, some of them just through common sense, so here are some of the actual complaints I've heard over the years that I really don't think are worth complaining about. Number 7. How are Marty and Jennifer in the future? The so-called problem with the film. If Doc takes Marty and Jennifer out of 1985 to show them 2015, shouldn't their older selves not already be in 2015? George and Lorraine and Biff weren't taken out of the time stream, they stayed in 1985 and had the chance to live over the next 30 years, but Marty and Jennifer were plucked out, so what gives? The answer is never actually explained in the movie itself, but the canonical answer given by the creators is consistent with the way time travel works throughout the trilogy. You see, the future hasn't been written yet, so it stands to reason that there are an infinite number of possible futures. And when someone from Back to the Future sees the future, what they are seeing is the most likely future from that point in time.
We know that this photograph represents what will happen if the events of today continue to run their course into tomorrow.
So when the photos start to fade, it doesn't mean that there's an entire timeline where Dave McFly is born without a head. It means that the ripple effect hasn't caught up to the future yet, so now we're caught between seeing the timeline where Dave is born and the timeline where he isn't, because at this point, both of them are likely timelines. And when Marty and Jennifer see 2015, they're seeing the most likely 2015 at that time. And at that time, the most likely scenario is Doc and Marty complete their mission, they all go back to 1985, Jennifer thinks it's all a dream and forgets about it, and they all get to grow old together towards 2015. Of course, this future is at risk if, say, Jennifer gets abducted by the police and faints and Doc is unable to retrieve her. Number 6. George's first novel. The so-called problem. How is George only publishing his first novel in 1985 if he was already an established local author when he was killed in 1973? Well, the movie doesn't give an answer, but I would venture a guess that, like most sci-fi writers, he wrote a lot of short stories before he wrote his first novel. Probably published in local publications, which is why he was a Hill Valley local celebrity, but not really a famous author yet. Okay, it may not be the most impressive answer, but it also wasn't a very impressive question. You can do better than that. Number 5.
Nobody calls me chicken needles. Nobody!
The so-called problem. Starting in the second movie, Marty really hates being called chicken. This never comes up in the first movie. What the hell? Okay, so even granting this question validity, it's not really a plot hole. At worst, it's a retcon. Most practically, it's something that just didn't come up in the first film. Now, some people have theorized that the chicken reaction is a character trait of the Marty who grew up with a happy family, and not the Marty from the timeline that we followed in the first film. Back to the Future never tells us if when you change timelines, your memories eventually get replaced via ripple effect with the memories of the you from that timeline, so let's assume that doesn't happen. Let's assume we are following the same Marty from the first movie, and if anyone had called him a chicken, he would have reacted similarly. Does it fit in with the Marty we know? We see Marty bewildered a lot in the first film, but we don't really see him scared all that much. But one thing that does seem to scare him is the possibility of being rejected in the pursuit of his dream. And when he catches himself showing fear, he immediately tries to put a stop to it.
What if they say, get out of here, kid, you got no future? I mean, I just don't think I can take that kind of rejection. Jesus, I'm starting to sound like my old man.
And there it is. Marty grew up in the original timeline watching his dad cower under Biff, watching his dad do anything Biff asked of him because he was scared. And Marty didn't want to be seen as scared because Marty's biggest fear was growing up to become his father. A fear that it turns out might have been somewhat justified. So if someone were to imply that Marty's a coward, it makes total sense that he'd be offended by that. And we know for a fact he has a confrontational streak, so he'd be unlikely to let an offense go. The actual "nobody calls me chicken" catchphrase may not have been conceived till the second movie, but the trait is completely in character for a sensitive yet aggressive little punk like Marty McFly. Number 4. Why doesn't Doc invent a fuel source? The so-called problem. Doc and Marty are stuck in 1885 because the DeLorean's out of gas and they can't get it up to 88, so they try all sorts of wacky hijinks to get it up to speed. But Doc is capable of inventing a refrigerator in the Old West, why can't he invent some wacky way to get it up to 88? The answer. I've seen numerous people ask this question, despite the fact that the movie repeatedly drives home why this isn't an option.
A month? Doc, you're gonna get shot on Monday.
I know.
Winter, Doc, what are you talking about? Monday, it's 3 days away.
Even if Doc is capable of inventing a fuel source, he does not have time to do so. And the one alternate fuel source they did try literally backfired in the worst possible way. A trickier question is why they didn't siphon the gas out of the other DeLorean that he boarded up for Marty and 55 Doc to find. The movie doesn't actually give an answer to that, but it's plausible that in the 9 months since arriving in 1885 with no time circuits and no flying circuits, he used the gas for some other purpose. Or maybe he just didn't think they could dig it out of the mine, siphon the gas, and then repack it back into the mine in time before Buford found him. Or maybe he just didn't think of it until after he already broke the engine. I don't know, there are possible answers to that question, but it's not a stupid question, so it doesn't make this list. Number 3. Why isn't Dave named Marty? The so-called problem. After Marty leaves George and Lorraine in the 50s, she comments on what a nice name Marty is. So why didn't she use it for her firstborn son? The answer? Because Marty McFly is not named after Calvin Klein. Marty McFly is named after a different Martin McFly.
Wait a minute. You have a brother named Martin McFly? I don't, brother.
Maybe right after the camera cuts, George mentions that he had a great-great-uncle named Martin who lived in the Old West. Or maybe he doesn't. Maybe the person they named Dave after is just someone they met later, or someone who was still more important in their life than any Martins they knew. Just because they like the name Marty doesn't mean it's their first choice for a child's name. Number 2. How did old Biff get back to 2015? The so-called problem. When Biff goes back to 1955 to give his younger self the almanac, how does he get back to the same 2015 that he left? Shouldn't he go back to the 2015 from after he ruined Hill Valley? Doesn't Doc explain why they can't go back to that 2015?
We travel into the future. From this point in time, it will be the future of this reality.
The answer. Is this really that confusing to anyone? 'Cause it's really pretty simple. The ripple effect just hadn't yet caught up to 2015 when Biff left 1955.
That's right, Marty! It's the ripple effect!
In Back to the Future, even though traveling through time is instantaneous, it takes time for changes in the time stream to take effect. And you may think that's stupid, that time takes time, but it's how the rules have always worked in this trilogy. It's the entire driving force of the first movie. Marty doesn't disappear immediately, the McFly kids slowly fade out over time because it takes a while for the ripple effect to catch up to them and change the future for certain. Ryan North described this as meta-time in his excellent riff review blog on the Back to the Future novelization, and while the actual amount of time it takes for changes in the time stream to take effect is a bit unpredictable, Ryan might have actually figured out the mathematical formula for it, which is really damn impressive. I aspire to be that nerdy. But the point is, Biff traveled from 1955 to 2015 instantaneously, while it took a little longer for the ripple effect to travel to 60 years. And by the time Doc and Marty figured out what was going on, the ripple effect had already passed them, and it would have been too late for them to go to 2015. Maybe it's not how time travel would work in real life, but it's how time travel works in the first movie, so if you accepted that, you can accept this. And the number one stupidest nitpick about Back to the Future, why don't George and Lorraine recognize Marty? The so-called problem. Why don't George and Lorraine notice how much their son looks like Calvin Klein? Doesn't George find it suspicious that his so-called son looks a lot like his wife's high school boyfriend? This one is just so stupid that it almost infuriates me that I still see people bringing it up. I mean, just think about it. George and Lorraine knew Calvin Klein for 1 week. 1 week 30 years ago. And they don't have any pictures of him. You expect them to remember exactly what he looks like? There were kids I went to school with from 3rd grade all the way to senior year of high school who I couldn't pick out of a lineup today. Oh, but Calvin Klein was such an important part of their life. Yeah, there were people in school who I considered my best friend for over a year who I keep forgetting about today. I might just be a terrible person, but still. Sure, Calvin introduced them, but it's not like a close personal friend introducing you to your significant other and then remaining in your life. It's more like the failed blind date you were on before you ran into the love of your life at a bar.
Well, Marty, I want to thank you for all your good advice. I'll never forget it.
But I'll proudly forget you. I mean, yeah, you were crucial in bringing us together, but now that we are together, we're too distracted by each other to remember details like which random weirdo stranger initiated this. Also, your music sucks. But let's just suppose that they do remember what Calvin looks like. They remember the contextless face of 17-year-old Marty McFly that they met 30 years ago. But when they look at Marty in 1985, they're not seeing the contextless face of 17-year-old Marty McFly. They're seeing their son. They're seeing every memory of him as a baby, him as a toddler, him as a 5-year-old, him growing into the 17-year-old son they have today. Most people don't see the faces of their loved ones in an objective, contextless void. They see the faces of their loved ones. And for most of us, context affects recognition just as much as actual resemblance does. It's why you can walk by a famous person without even noticing them, but you recognize them when you see them on your TV. Maybe they noticed at some point that he kind of resembled the guy they hadn't seen in 30 years, but it's a much bigger stretch to assume that they would recognize him as identical than that they would never make the connection. I mean, for crying out loud! Why am I getting so defensive over this? None of these things matter. Even if there was validity to these questions, they don't ruin the movies. I mean, details like this aren't what make a movie good or bad, what make a movie enjoyable or unenjoyable. If someone's using these points as excuses for not liking the films, it's because they already didn't like them for other reasons, maybe reasons that they couldn't put their finger on, and they're just grasping at whatever they can. And if you don't like Back to the Future, hey, more power to you. I still love it, and I suspect I will for all time. This video is not going to change anyone's mind if they don't trust the trilogy. It's just an excuse for me to talk about something I love that I've spent way too many hours thinking about. So, whether you agree with me or not that these points in the movies actually do make sense, all I can say is, have a happy future. I'm going to go catch a matinee of Jaws 19. So until next time, this is Dave signing off.
In the year 2015, just like the silver screen has already foreseen, here's the scene.
When are we? Wednesday, October 21st, 2015.
October 21st, 2015. You're gonna wear pants inside out like the teens. Every shoe's gonna be self-tied, and your jacket will be self-dried. October 21st, 2015. Pepsi Perfect is your source of caffeine. You drink it from a funky can. Frodo don't wanna use his hands. October 21st, 2015. Every room in your house has a fax machine. The window screen will always break. The shark is gonna still look fake. October 21st, 2015. Somehow the Cubs are gonna be the winning team. The rain will clear up by 5 o'clock. But the post office is still gonna suck. Whoa, whoa.
Too bad the post office isn't as efficient as the weather service. Don't talk to anyone. Don't touch anything. Don't do anything.
In the year 2015, when docs are coming from across the time stream, Roger Rabbit wants to save the clock tower. Those boards don't work unless you got power. In the year 2015, Biff is gonna hijack the time machine. He'll take it back to the first flick and teach himself some betting tricks. Whoa, whoa. October 21st, 2015. I'm kinda wondering why none of that is what I'm seeing. There ain't no hoverboards and the cars ain't flying. Somebody must have screwed up the timeline. Whoa, whoa. Now it is that future year. None of that cool stuff is here. But when it gets me down, I recall the words of Doc Brown. future's not written yet. It's whatever we make of it, though we don't know what it holds. Where we go, we don't need roads. October 21st, 2015, just like the silver screen has already foreseen. Here's the scene. October 20.
Hey everyone, Dave here, and thanks for indulging me as I celebrate the most important date in cinema history in my own ridiculous way. If you enjoyed this video, why don't you check out below the 2 other videos I made about Back to the Future this month. And if you didn't enjoy this video, then I'll just make like a tree.
There! I did it! David Gansel here. Please pardon the crudity of my broadcast signal, but I'm coming to you from the year 2021. Welcome to Armchair Imagineering. I've gone on record many times as someone who loves the Simpsons ride, but wishes it didn't have to replace Back to the Future. I get that we're well past the future that the ride depicted, but that's a really easy fix. Just get Christopher Lloyd to double-line saying, "We've entered an alternate 2015." Or just change the time display to always be 25 years from the date you're riding. It's not specifically 2015, it's just always the future. Or just leave it as is because the average guest really doesn't care. But I don't want to lose the Simpsons ride. I mean, I know we probably will. When the licensing agreement is up, unless Disney lets Universal keep The Simpsons in exchange for Florida Marvel rights, they're gonna snag The Simpsons away from them and put them in a new version of the Bakery Tour video or something. But assuming The Simpsons ride stays in place, where could Universal put a reopened Back to the Future ride? What could be Back to the Future's density? If only Universal Orlando had an entire new park opening and a need for new themed lands. That's right. I'm pitching Back to the Future Land as one of the epic universes for Universal to epically put in Universal's epic universe. I know guests can see Hill Valley in Hollywood, but the average guest can't walk around it, and Universal Orlando has never had a real clock tower, and it's high time that was rectified. At one point, both coasts had the Psycho House. There's no reason both coasts can't save the clock tower. But to do justice to a Back to the Future land, this can't be an internally consistent, makes sense in canon land like Galaxy's Edge. See, what makes Galaxy's Edge work is they were able to craft a new planet that could incorporate everything you'd want from a Star Wars experience. As long as you had a market, a cantina, a few opposing military bases, and a place for a spaceship to launch, you could craft a whole new terrain around it, and it would make sense. With Back to the Future, the things you'd want from the experience are from different decades, so they can't coexist canonically. Unless you craft some backstory about Hill Valley being caught up in some sort of time vortex paradox bubble that's causing multiple timelines to converge on a single moment, or something, I don't know. The point is, this is far more likely to be like Wizarding World, where it sort of takes place in all parts of the timeline at once. And at the center would be the Hill Valley Courthouse, and every 15 minutes, thanks to projection mapping, it would transform before your eyes into the courthouse in a different era, much like the transforming Beast Library in the animation building in California Adventure. It would start as the 1955 courthouse with a working clock, then it would appear to get struck by lightning and transform into the 1985 Department of Social Services with the clock stuck at 10:04, then it would transform into the 2015 Courthouse Mall, and finally into the 1885 under construction courthouse with no visible clock at all, continuing to loop through the 4 iterations every hour. So, aside from the Institute of Future Technology and the magical transforming clock tower, what are the top experiences that would cause me to immediately make like a tree and get over to Hill Valley Land? Well, I think the Cafe 80s is a gimme. The thing looks like it was built for a theme park already. I think everyone my age would love to be told that we're old and boring by Elijah Wood. Then I think it would be fun to pop into Biff Tannen's Pleasure Paradise Casino. It would actually be an arcade, but, you know, themed to a sleazy casino. Although if they could bring back that Back to the Future slot machine that I never got a chance to play, I would like to try that out. I also think it would be worth adding the train from Part 3. Not the time train photo op, but an actual rideable train. Maybe Epic Universe could have a train that goes around the park Magic Kingdom style, and the Hill Valley stop could be the Old West train station. Then there's a show venue in the Hill Valley High School stage, all decked out for the Enchantment Under the Sea dance. The venue could host a concert that takes you through the different decades covered in the franchise, with a band that seems to transform from era to era, traveling through time while we watch them play music on stage. Kinda like that Rock the Jukebox show that I riffed at Hershey Park a while back, but focusing on the eras of music covered in the franchise. Alternately, the stage could host a condensed version of that new Back to the Future musical if that ends up being a hit. And why not? Let's add a roller coaster. I know that originally a roller coaster was considered for the Back to the Future ride, but Universal Creative realized they couldn't effectively tell a character-driven story on a traditional roller coaster. A lesson their main competition seemed to forget a few decades later. But while a roller coaster may not be the best way to tell a Back to the Future theme park story, I think it is a fine thing to coexist with the already established Back to the Future ride. It wouldn't have to be a full narrative experience, it could just be a good roller coaster that launches you at 88 miles per hour through a track with light-up effects, emulating the lightning and the flames while Alan Silvestri's iconic theme plays. Would I want this to be the only Back to the Future ride that exists? Of course not. But I want it in a Back to the Future land, especially a Back to the Future land that, as established, is not trying to fit into the canon, so we don't need to narratively justify why there's roller coaster tracks in the land. And even though it never made much sense, just as a nod to the franchise's theme park history, let's throw in Doc Brown's Fried Chicken. Now, is this likely to happen? Of course not. None of the revealed Epic Universe concept art even hints at Back to the Future being part of it. But you know what? This park's future hasn't been written yet. No one's has. This park's future is what Universal makes of it. So Universal, make it a good one. I rescind all rights to any of these ideas to you, Universal Studios, just whatever it takes to allow me to revisit the Institute of Future Technology. I know whoever runs Back to the Future's Twitter account is on board with it. In the meantime, do you have any other Back to the Future theme park ideas? Let's discuss this in the comments, and until next time, I'll see you in the future.
Merry Christmas Eve, everyone. You know, as the holiday season is upon us, my mind tends to go to thoughts of gigawatts and flux capacitors. Yes, with Telltale releasing Episode 1 of Back to the Future the game earlier this week, you knew I had to talk about it. If you saw the goofy video I posted the other day, you know how excited I was about this game. It's my favorite game company doing the sequel, essentially, to my favorite movie franchise, so you knew that I had to play the game and I would have to talk about it. And I've played through the game twice now, and I have several thoughts on it. And, well, I'm going to start with the negative things just to get it out of the way. The game is really short and really, really, really easy. Now, short, I mean, it's just one episode out of 5, and, you know, short is typical for a Telltale episode. But it felt shorter than most other first Telltale episodes of seasons that I've played, and it was definitely the easiest Telltale episode I've ever played. There were only about 6 or so puzzles, all of which were extremely easy, and I realize why they do this. I realize they're trying to reach out to people who are less familiar with adventure games. You figure Back to the Future is a very widespread franchise. It has a huge fan base, and not everybody is going to want to figure out how to use a monkey wrench on a pipe to access a waterfall. Still, it was almost annoyingly easy at times. There were a couple of bugs at the game. I didn't have as many as some other people did, but the launch of the game was a little buggy, and it was a few hours before I could actually install the game so that it worked. But, I mean, obviously that should be taken care of by now. This is kind of typical in Telltale, but I was sometimes annoyed by the arbitrary places that you couldn't walk. There's one place in particular, you keep walking to visit Doc in his jail cell, and you can only walk along the sidewalk or cross the street at certain points, whereas it would be much less annoying to just be able to cross the street from the jail cell to get back to town square. I figure this is probably a camera angles thing or something. They didn't want to have to account for people crossing the street at random points. But it's still annoying to have to walk all the way back over to where Doc is, then walk all the way to the crosswalk, come over and walk all the way back to Town Square. It's not annoying as, say, again, Monkey Island 2, where you have to travel from island to island to finish tasks, but it's still just irritating enough. My final negative point, I was not crazy about the explanation for why the DeLorean still exists after Part 3. It seemed a little too coincidental, a little too lucky, and it seemed like it was bringing up new types of science fiction that haven't been established in the movies, which was kind of unsettling. But it's only explained briefly, so either it's setting up for another plot point, in which case my opinion could turn around, or it was just so quick that I can ignore it, and so either way it's not a huge deal. But those are the negative points. The positive aspects. Everything else. The atmosphere was perfect. The voice acting was wonderful. Christopher Lloyd. I've met Christopher Lloyd in person. He's a very shy, quiet man. Obviously, Doc Brown is the exact opposite of that. And it's great to know that even at his age, he can still launch right into the Doc Brown character. He sounded wonderful. AJ Locascio, of course, is nearly pitch perfect as Marty McFly. And James Arnold Taylor as a young Emmett Brown. I got so into the story that I forgot I was listening to two different voice actors as young Doc and old Doc. The atmosphere feels like a Back to the Future game. We see several locations from the films, most of them pretty briefly, but we see them and they fit right in with the universe of the movies. Visually, I think this is Telltale's best game yet. I know some people aren't crazy about the cartoony style, but I think it works. I never questioned which character I was looking at from the series. Visually, it's more detailed than any other Telltale game I've ever played. Possible exception of Poker Night, but that's sort of a different animal. Like I said, the locations from the movies, especially Doc's lab and the clock tower, they look straight out of the Back to the Future universe. And even the final puzzle with the looping animation driving down the road, the looping was much longer than similar scenes in previous Telltale games. Much longer, much more detailed. You drove past more landmarks. The music. Jared Emerson Johnson has created the perfect soundtrack for this. It sounds just like it belongs in Alan Silvestri's soundtrack for the movies. He weaves the classic theme, the motifs in with ambient music, and it just works really well. Jared Emerson Johnson is a genius. And the story felt like a Back to the Future story. It felt like I was rejoining old friends. It was like Marty and Doc never left. The story was great. The visuals I loved. The voice acting I loved. The atmosphere, the tone, it was all very Back to the Future-y, and, I don't know how much of that was Bob Gale's mandate and how much was just the Telltale crew being the right kind of Back to the Future fanboys, but no matter how they got to the point where it feels like a natural extension of the Back to the Future universe, much more so than the animated series, and even more so than the ride, which I loved. It's the perfect continuation of the Back to the Future story so far, and this is just part one. I'm sure as the story unfolds, it will get even better, which is the case with most Telltale games. Tales of Monkey Island really started picking up story-wise, I remember, around episodes 3 and 4. So really, the game is great, except for the gameplay. And I realize that sounds silly, but honestly, especially when it comes to Back to the Future, gameplay is a secondary concern to me after atmosphere, characters, and story. I care a lot about the Back to the Future stories, and I am much happier that we got a good story with mediocre puzzles than I would have if we had gotten great puzzles with a story that didn't feel like it belonged to Back to the Future. And again, they're trying to draw non-adventure gamers in with this first episode, so I'm certainly hoping that the puzzles get more complex and more thought out as the episodes progress. But honestly, for now, I've played through the game twice, and I was just smiling ear to ear through both playthroughs. Even just the little touches I liked. Like, you can choose between 3 pop culture references for Marty to choose as his fake name for 1931, and the game will react accordingly. That's not a major thing, but just that little touch sort of gives me hope that in the future we'll be shaping the story a little more on our own as we control Marty. A lot of people are probably going to complain that the only action sequences are in cutscenes. This doesn't surprise me, given Telltale's previous games, but, even as far back as Sam & Max, they had a driving sequence, so it would be nice if we got at least one DeLorean driving sequence over the course of the game, but, it's not going to bother me if we don't. But it might bother some people who want something very different from a Back to the Future game. But as for me, this is what I want. This is exactly what I wanted. A Back to the Future story that felt right, felt in keeping with the saga, and felt like visiting old friends again. It was great to play with Marty and Doc again, and I just can't wait until the next episode in February. Hey everyone, Dave here. Well, the other day marked the release of Back to the Future, the game, Episode 2, Get Tannin'. The release just sort of sneaked up on everyone, and as you can see, it put me in a festive Back to the Future mood. I was actually wearing this shirt coming out of the gym today, and the manager told me he was an extra in Part 3, so that's pretty cool. About the game. I'm going to start by talking about the gameplay, which once again is short and easy, but I think it's a step in the right direction. It was a little bit longer than part 1 of the game was, at least when I played through it. And there were more puzzles that had potential. The solutions were still really obvious. There's a part where you have to hide in a crate to get taken into the speakeasy, and there are a couple of crates, only one of them you can hide in, but it's the first one you see, so it's not really like you have to deduce anything, you just click on the first thing you see. But there are some other puzzles that were interesting and that actually required a tiny bit of thinking. The gameplay still has many flaws. There were several parts that probably should have been playable that were in cutscenes. Some of the action sequences probably could have made for playable puzzles. And there were probably a few parts that should have been cutscenes that were playable. There were also a handful of glitches in the game. The game keeps track of what name you gave as Marty in your last saved game from Episode 1. And it mostly worked, but there was one case where I was called by the wrong name, and I've heard other people have had even more trouble in that arena. There were a number of glitches in the parts where, without spoiling too much, there's a sequence where young Emmett is on the roof of a building trying to retrieve something, and there are a couple of ways you can interact with him or things around him where it'll go back to the default response from him from before he was on the roof. So all of a sudden he'll just teleport down to the town square and then he'll teleport back up, which is distracting to say the least. So the gameplay has flaws, but I don't follow Telltale for the gameplay as much as I do for the story and the characters and the humor, which is the same reason I love Back to the Future, is the story, characters, and humor. So how does the story hold up? I have a few more issues with it than I did with Episode 1's story. It's probably partly because Episode 1, it was still novel and exciting. It was the first return to Back to the Future, and it was the first time seeing Marty and Doc again, so there was all that excitement. And now with Episode 2, now that initial thrill is gone, I have a few more problems with it. Not a whole bunch, but a few. The story, it's basically Back to the Future Part 2. It starts with a minor problem that's solved involving one of Marty's family members. Then they return to present-day Hill Valley, and everything seems normal, but then they find that it's overrun by Tannen's influence, and then they have to go back and fix whatever went wrong. And it's Back to the Future Part 2. They even have some of the classic, avoid your other self, that made the second movie so much fun. Except it's not so much fun when they do it in the game. That was actually the most boring part of the gameplay for me. There are also... I had a little bit of issue with how some of the things in Part 1 of the game didn't have nearly as strong of consequences as I would have expected. They still had consequences, but they weren't as far-reaching. after you break young Emmett's heart in the first one, but he still helps you anyway, because you inspired him to take a stand for himself, so that effect does carry in. Emmett is more confident than he was in part 1, but he also just, is very casual when he sees you again after you go back to 1931. It's a few months after you were there in episode 1, and so he's like, oh, I haven't seen you in a few months, but I'm barely even going to look at you. I'm just going to say, oh, hi, Harry Callahan, or whatever name you chose. Oh, yeah, I've been watching after your dog for you for the past several months, even though you never asked me to do that. And why did they leave Heinstein behind in 1931 when they thought that everything was okay? I don't know. I don't get it. It seemed a little out of character. But there are a lot of things I like, though. I liked the further exploration of Kid Tannen's gang, and I liked the prospect of him still being in control in 1985 or 1986, even though that was never quite fully explored as much as it could be. This was another thing that slightly bugged me. For the second time in a row, we hear Lorraine's voice but don't see her. And in the preview for episode 3 at the end of the game, we do see Lorraine, so we know that they have a Lorraine model, but I guess they just didn't have it ready for episodes 1 and 2. And it's just very odd, considering the movies focus so much on Leah Thompson characters, but of course, for obvious reasons, didn't have Crispin Glover characters so much after part 1. Whereas the game is focusing much more on George and his father, they're both the Crispin Glover lookalikes, and the Leah Thompson character just sort of gets shoved aside. It's a little strange, but I mean, I like that they're exploring more of the George side of the family, because that George is one of my favorite characters in the series, so I really think his family history warrants exploration. And again, I liked things about it. I liked the speakeasy. I thought that there was some fun stuff there. I like that we see Jennifer's grandfather. And again, I feel like more could be explored there, and maybe more will in the upcoming parts. But it's good to see the ancestors of some of the other characters who don't get quite as much play in the movies. Now, the cliffhanger to episode 3, even though I sort of could tell what the cliffhanger was going to be, I still thought it was done well. It was presented in a way that pretty effectively built up suspense. I'm very curious about the direction episode 3 is going to go. I'm worried a little bit that it's going to be another rehash of, alternate 1985, of Tannen-controlled 1985, except, obviously with a different character in control. But I'm curious about it in terms of, I'm just going to spoil this for you now. In episode 3, it's clear that Doc is not helping Marty. And it'll be really interesting to see Marty come into his own without having Doc looking over his shoulder. If they flesh this idea out to its full potential, this could be really interesting character growth for Marty McFly. Finally, yes, they do the Tannen manure joke again, and it felt really forced this time. Like, I was happy to see that in episode 1 of the game, but in episode 2, it's just suddenly the manure truck's there. I could buy that in episode 1, but in episode 2, I'm like, okay, you're really milking the manure gag. But one running gag they used that they put a twist on that I liked is they actually had Kid Tannen do a "what the hell is that?" to distract somebody. And it was interesting to see a Tannen pull that on somebody else. So yeah, I enjoyed it, not quite as much as episode 1, even though I think the gameplay itself was better. I think the gameplay is slowly growing. It probably won't develop fast enough to get to a point where hardcore adventure gamers are going to be happy with it. But considering that I've seen a lot of people struggle with the really, really easy puzzles in episode 1, apparently Telltale knew what they were doing, reaching out to non-gaming Back to the Future fans, because I thought episode 1 was probably the easiest adventure game I've ever played, but I still see people struggling with it who aren't as used to the adventure game genre, so clearly Telltale knew exactly what demographic they were going after. And again, I follow Telltale games and Back to the Future for the story, characters, and humor, and I've been mostly enjoying the story, characters, and humor, even though I had a few issues with the latest part, but I'm still really looking forward to see where they go. I would like some more complex gameplay. I would like some more interesting puzzles, and puzzles where they don't make the solution so blaringly obvious. And I think the puzzles are slowly getting better. Not fast enough for everyone to be happy, but I'm still enjoying the game. So I look forward to episode 3, and I really want to see where the story goes. In other adventure games that are great with atmosphere but light on puzzles news, the 3rd episode of The Silver Lining, the King's Quest fan game, just came out, so I will be installing and playing that. And I'll probably let you know what I thought. Until then, this is Dave, signing off. Wow, crazy week. With all the news going on, it seems a little weird to just be talking about silly video games, but on the other hand, I'm not really qualified to talk about anything else in life. So, Telltale's Back to the Future chapters 3 and 4. I didn't review episode 3 yet because it came out while I was in the middle of traveling for a couple of weeks, and I didn't really have a chance to record a vlog while I was traveling, and by the time I got back, I was like, might as well wait for chapter 4 to come out and review both of them, so here they are. Okay, first off, yes, gameplay, more of the same, easy puzzles, very simple stuff, slightly better. Each episode is improving slightly on a gameplay and puzzle standpoint, but really not enough to really matter. It's basically, Chapter 4 of Back to the Future is a really easy adventure game, where Chapter 1 was a ridiculously easy one. It's typical adventure game puzzle structure, 3 main trials going on and on. In Chapter 3, the 3 trials are 3 laws you have to break, and in Chapter 4, it's 3 ways to make Emmett undesirable to Edna. But yeah, they're both very short. Chapter 3 felt really short just because the boss fight was so anticlimactic that I was like, that's it? It's over? Really? The most interesting puzzle in both of them, actually, though, was in Chapter 3. The one that to me was most interesting, and even it wasn't anything special. It was breaking the PDA law, where you had to win a guitar duel against Leech, who, if you read the Telltale forums, was originally supposed to be Needles, but apparently there was some sort of likeness issue, I'm not sure. Anyway, the point is you have to beat him in a guitar battle. It isn't really anything we haven't seen before, but it's different than the other puzzles, so it was fun there. It's actually really reminiscent of the Deliverance spoof from Curse of Monkey Island, the dueling banjos part. Except instead of imitating the other person, you are leading the other person and trying to get them where you want to go. But, other than that, puzzles are standard at best, non-existent at worst. But, hey. The other thing that really bugged me about the gameplay was, in Chapter 4 especially, apparently there's a specific order you're supposed to do some things in, and they don't account for you doing them in a different order. This has always been a problem Telltale has occasionally, and lots of adventure games, it's not just Telltale. But it was really noticeable in Chapter 4 when you had, you clicked around Emmett's lab before talking to him, and you're learning all the stuff about different elements of the personality profile. The personality profiler, but then when you actually talk to Emmett, you still ask him, what's a personality profiler? And it's like, Marty, you idiot, you just learned about the personality profiler. The other case where it was really noticeable was if you already have Emmett's photo album, and then you talk to Trixie, and she's like, does he have a photo album? And you're like, gee, I don't know. It's like, you're holding it, you idiot! It's just a minor annoyance. It's not like it's game breaking or anything, but it still kind of bugs me. I mean, in this day and age, King's Quest 6 was 20 years ago, and it accounted for talking to people in different orders. Like if you talk to somebody in the Village of the Crown first, you didn't then ask the guard dogs, wait, what island is this? Minor annoyance, but it does break the verisimilitude. But, as I always say, I'm following these games for the stories and the characters, and Chapters 3 and 4 did add some elements that we've never seen in the Back to the Future series before. Chapter 3, for instance, okay, it's not the most original premise. It's very 1984 / Clockwork Orange / moral guardian dystopia of your choice. It's themes that we've seen a lot, but we've never seen in the context of the Back to the Future universe, which makes it kind of fun. I mean, it's even the things in the Back to the Future movies, you know, we've all seen westerns, we just haven't seen them done Back to the Future style. And in this case, you know, obviously it begs comparison to Biff's timeline in Back to the Future Part 2, when Biff's in control of Hill Valley, but, you know, it's the polar opposite, where that one was all about anarchy and chaos, and this one's all about going too far in the other direction with order and the rules, obviously, given who's in charge here. It's also worth noting that Chapter 3 has no time travel in it, just the aftermath and the repercussions of time travel, which some people were upset about, but, you know, that's what most of the first movie was, so it's not like it's it's not like it's breaking Back to the Future law to have a segment with no time travel. So in this timeline, Doc is married to Edna Strickland, which really amuses me considering Principal Strickland's comments about Doc in the first movie. The key to Back to the Future is the friendship between Marty and Doc, at least for me. Much in the same way for a lot of Star Trek fans, the key to that franchise is the friendship between Kirk, McCoy, and Spock. It's all about Marty and Doc's relationship and their friendship, and that's really what makes the movies fun and really drives them. So it's really interesting to suddenly be thrown into a Hill Valley where Marty and Doc aren't friends. It is interesting, but it could have been more interesting. Now, there's still room for this, but I was a little let down. I didn't think they explored Marty having to deal with not having Doc as much as they could have. I know they already touched on that thematically, like at the very beginning of the series when Marty doesn't know where Doc is. But here was a chance to give Marty the opportunity to really come into his own. And they don't really take it. They never really give Marty a puzzle or a problem that he would normally have run to Doc for. There's a part at the very beginning where he does a sort of makeshift invention using a hover wheel, but it's a very brief, very easy puzzle. Again, the most memorable puzzle in the game involves the guitar, which is right up Marty's alley. And I would have liked to see more puzzles involving Marty figuring things out on his own without Doc's help, in a situation where he would normally need Doc's help. However, the scene where Marty first encounters Doc, or First Citizen Brown as he's known in this timeline, is spectacular. Spoiling just a little bit, that obviously this is a more intimidating Emmett Brown than we're used to. First Citizen Brown, Christopher Lloyd is channeling a bit of his Judge Doom persona, which is a lot of fun, but still intimidating. But in many ways, he's still the same Emmett. He has, deep down, he's got a lot of the same, you know, he started off as the same person. And there's this moment when he's just starting to believe that Marty comes from another timeline, and he's just starting to believe his whole crazy story, and he's looking back over his life and listening to Marty's description of what his life was in his timeline. And there's a moment where he just pauses and asks, Am I happy there? And it's heartbreaking. It's like, holy crap, this is a world where Emmett Brown, our beloved Doc, is miserable. And so First Citizen Brown joins Marty, and Chapter 4 begins with Marty being Doc's mentor and teaching him the ropes, similar to the 1955 parts of the first movie. And it's demonstrated subtly when they first come into 1931 Town Square, and it's First Citizen Brown who almost gets hit by a car crossing the street. It was a little nod, but it made me smile. Now I'll confess, I was a little confused as to how quickly First Citizen Brown was going along with it. I was like, It felt sort of like Billy the Kid in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. He was dealing with the oddity of time travel with the greatest of ease. But it turned out that he still does have his reservations. He just doesn't let on to them right away. And while most of Chapter 4 was pretty standard adventuring with Marty and seemingly normal Doc, I'm trying not to give too much away, but you knew it was going to get dark right before the last episode anyway. And the thing that really makes Chapter 4 shine is when they bring up something that's always sort of been lurking in the Back to the Future series, but has never been addressed, and that is the ethics of changing the timeline. For the first time in the history of the Back to the Future franchise, the question comes up, who is Marty to say that his timeline is the correct one? Who is Marty to say, every time Marty changes the past to the timeline that's better for his family, does he really have the right to do that? Sure, Biff is a bad guy. It's probably best for everyone that he's not rich and successful like in his timeline in Back to the Future 2. But still, I mean, who knows whose other lives he's affected along the way, and just because he makes things better for his parents, even if he's doing it for selfless reasons, if he really thinks that he's making things better for his family, making things better for Doc, does that still give him the right to go around messing with history? And, they've addressed in the movies the dangers of time travel and changing the past, but never the ethics. And it was fantastic to see that brought up in the Back to the Future context. And the scene where it's brought up is again a little heartbreaking, and it's really intense as it sets up what I presume is the final conflict for the series. And holy crap, I mean, again, I don't want to spoil anything, but I'm really intrigued and really looking forward to Chapter 5 now. It's great to finally see Lorraine, and she and George are sort of back to their personas from the beginning of the first movie, because all that stuff in the 50s never happened the same way it did at the end of the movie. Although Lorraine's a bit more cheerful than she is at the first movie, I was actually really interested to see that in the first Citizen Brown timeline, Marty seemed a lot closer to Lorraine than he did to George. And I don't know if they're going to explore that. Probably not, since we're probably kind of done with that timeline. I don't know. But it was interesting to me, especially after the game so far had just been about George and Artie and really nothing on Lorraine's side. So it was kind of funny to me that in this timeline, like, Lorraine and Marty sort of have a closer bond than George and Marty do. And Claudia Wells, it was great to hear Claudia Wells as Jennifer again. And once again, it's a different take on Jennifer than we've seen before. And admittedly, probably any actress could have pulled it off, but having it be Claudia just, added that slight touch of authenticity, especially since Christopher Lloyd wasn't in Chapter 3 very much, so here we had our official actor in again. Although, by this point, I kind of consider AJ Locascio an official actor, because as far as I'm concerned, he can go on voicing Marty McFly forever in whatever they need him for. But it's still, Claudia Wells, I mean, I've met her once, she's a really sweet person, and it's just great to have her be a part of the Back to the Future franchise again. As always, there are several movie references, a lot of Star Wars references in between these two episodes, which, Star Wars references are easy, but they're fun. And, very obvious Clockwork Orange references. But I am such a dork, but the reference that made me smile the most was the In-N-Out Burger reference. There's a bit on one of the intercoms where you click on it and Marty's like, yeah, I'll have a double animal style, and I'm like, ah! Yeah, In-N-Out Burger is the thing I miss most about the West Coast when I'm not there. Yes, fast food geek, I know, that's a new one. So anyway, if you haven't been enjoying Telltale's Back to the Future because of the gameplay, if the easy puzzles are just pissing you off that much, these entries are not going to change your mind. And I'll admit it, I wish the gameplay was better. I wish there were more interesting puzzles. I wish there were more memorable puzzles. And I'm kind of, part of me is kind of hoping that there's a season 2 just so that Telltale actually has a chance to do justice to the gameplay side of things. But once again, the story makes up for it for me. I'm really on the edge of my seat with this story. Not only is it just great to visit Marty and Doc again and, visit the classic Hill Valley situations, but it's actually adding things to the franchise, moral dilemmas and new perspectives on characters. It's actually contributing to the Back to the Future mythology and not just leeching off of it like so many licensed games do. These story elements added, if this story was given to a new movie, I'd consider it a worthy entry in the film series. I don't want there to be a new movie because I'd rather just have there be the perfect little trilogy that there is. But, if it had this story and if it was done right, I'd be up with it. I'd be up for it. But again, I'm on the edge of my seat waiting for Chapter 5. I really can't wait to see how this turns out. I can't even begin to imagine how this is all going to resolve itself. I hope it does resolve itself. I have faith in Telltale's storytelling abilities, and I have faith in Bob Gale's veto power if they come up with an idea that's just too stupid. But, everything in me is on the edge of my seat waiting for June, waiting to see how this all turns out. Well, the day has come. Telltale's Back to the Future the game has reached its end. After spending the last several months revisiting Marty, Doc, Biff, and their families, this particular adventure in Hill Valley has come to a close. Chapter 5, Out of Time, wraps up this season, and how does it stack up? About the same as the other chapters, which is to say there's good and there's bad. Let's start off with the bad. Again, the gameplay. It's not a good sign when the first puzzle in your game is click on this thing until you catch it. Still, overall, in keeping with the gradual progression of the series, this episode did have the best puzzles in the game so far. They were all the way up to mediocre at this point, so small victories, I guess. But this episode still had a lot of the glitches that have been plaguing the game so far. There are characters in the background interacting with people who aren't there, or there are characters who jump back to a place where they were before for certain lines of dialogue, just because that's the way the script dictates. There's the part where you're supposed to be talking to Edna on the phone. If you already complete that part and Edna leaves, if you try and call her, then it'll cut to shots of the empty phone booth with Edna's voice still talking, and you're interacting with her as if she's there, even though she's gone. So, yeah, that's stuff that really should have been caught in playtesting. But once again, this game is being driven by the story, and the characters, and the general Back to the Future-ness of it all. And in that regard, yeah, I thought this chapter was a pretty good conclusion to this season. I thought it resolved all the arcs in a way that, I was mostly satisfied. I didn't have any major unanswered questions. I thought it played a little loose with the rules of Back to the Future time travel, but that's nothing new. It didn't leave me demanding answers that I didn't get. It was a basically satisfying wrap-up, and there were some really great scenes, like the bit where, I don't want to spoil anything, but the bit with Edna's memory, that scene was pretty funny, and a little bit unsettling, but I enjoyed it. It didn't feel too short, it didn't feel too rushed. Some parts feel rushed, but I thought it was not only the most satisfying individual chapter, but it was also, it made the series as a whole satisfying story-wise. But although it was satisfying, there weren't really many surprises. Most of the plot twists you could kind of see coming ahead of time. That's not a big deal. But, like, the answer to the mystery of who the speakeasy arsonist is the obvious answer. Everybody guessed it ahead of time, and I actually guessed wrong just because it was the obvious answer. I thought, no, there's no way they'd make it that obvious. But what do I know? That didn't bother me so much, but You know, if they were really trying to shock us with that one, or shock us with the Marty's grandparents thing, nothing shocking at all. But the final scene of the game, well, first of all, the final scene was really funny and felt really appropriate for Back to the Future. But the final unanswered question that gets answered is why Doc went back to 1931 in the first place. That's the one I didn't see coming, and while it's not a shocking twist or anything, it's a really nice, heartwarming moment, which is followed by a really hilarious moment. And that pretty much captures all of Back to the Future right there. Michael J. Fox's cameos were fantastic. I don't want to spoil anything about the roles he played, even though you probably guessed them all already. Even if you hadn't guessed already, the hints they drop in the Telltale blog weren't exactly subtle. But his roles were great. It was great to hear his voice again, and it's another testament to how good a job A.J. Locascio has been doing, that there are bits of dialogue between Michael J. Fox and A.J. Locascio where, for a split second at the beginning of each line, I wasn't quite sure which actor was saying which line. So, great to hear his voice, great to hear him with Christopher Lloyd in some scenes. Yeah, that was really special. So, now that the entire season is over, what are my thoughts on Back to the Future, the game as a whole? Well, it was everything I desperately hoped it would be, and nothing I expected it to be, not necessarily in a good way. I was really anxiously hoping that it would be a good Back to the Future experience, a story told by people who understand what makes Back to the Future work. You know, people like Bob Gale. And, you know, I hoped it would really capture the magic of Back to the Future and contribute new things to the canon. Whether or not you consider spin-offs as canon is... That's not my point. That it would feel like not only an extension of the films, but an actual supplement, something that actually contributes to the Back to the Future mythology. And I got that. But I just took it for granted that it would be an interesting game. And I didn't really get that. And you know me, I'm more of a story, character, humor person than a gameplay person. If Secret of Monkey Island had lousy puzzles, but it still had the same characters and humor, atmosphere, and story that it has now, I would probably still play it several times a year as one of my favorite games. Meanwhile, if Monkey Island had the same exact gameplay with all the same interesting puzzles, but it didn't have the comedy and it didn't have the style, then I wouldn't care about it. All that goes to show is if I'm complaining about how simple the gameplay is, then you know there's a problem. But, you know, I'm really happy that it didn't disgrace Back to the Future as a story. You know, I'm happy that it felt like Marty and Doc. I'm happy that it was Marty and Doc. So many people from the movies involved, bringing it that authenticity, and just a really good Back to the Future story, I thought. Obviously not as great as any of the movies, but certainly better than most of the animated series, and even better than the ride, which, you know, I was such a huge fan of the ride at Universal, but it was a little hard to accept as actually going on in the Back to the Future universe. This game, it feels right at home. If this had been one of the movies, I wouldn't have questioned it. But if the game had also been fun to play, if the puzzles hadn't been just something I was trying to rush through in order to get to the next cutscene, but if the puzzles had actually been, you know, something that I wanted to help Marty solve, and not just, you know, hurry up and click this on this so I can see what Doc says next. If the gameplay had been better, then this game really would have been something phenomenal. As it was, it's already something that very few other movie-adapted licensed games are, which is a solid contribution to the film's mythology, but it's also got some of the negative sides of movie licensed games, such as not being a very good game. So, in total, good Back to the Future experience, bordering on great, but as a Back to the Future game, there's certainly plenty of room for improvement. And Telltale's been not exactly subtle about the fact that they'd like to do a Season 2. So, Telltale, if Season 2 comes out, if you're listening, here's what I want from Season 2. Because I'm on the internet, and therefore you must listen to me. 1. More challenging puzzles. You know this, I know this, we all know this. I keep harping on about it, but the game needs better puzzles. You have Marty separated from Doc a lot, so why not have Marty have to fix some device using only vague clues from Doc's scattered notes? Don't just tell us the solutions. Let us help Marty figure out the solutions. And most importantly, let us feel like we're helping Marty do things. Give us the feel that we're actually controlling Marty instead of just clicking on something and seeing what Marty does. I never got the real sense that I was controlling the character's actions, just that I was sort of nudging the character in a direction and he took it from there. And it was usually a direction that you had a big shiny arrow pointing to, so I knew exactly which direction to put him in. Give us the feeling that we're controlling Marty, and let us challenge our brains at least a tiny bit more. You know, you don't need to do Roberta Williams level puzzles here, but certainly more challenging than we've gotten so far. 2. An action sequence. I know. I was on the forums, I was telling people, well, Back to the Future doesn't need to be an action game because it's not really an action movie. There are only a couple of action sequences in the entire trilogy, and so we don't really need to be driving the DeLorean for it to be an authentic Back to the Future experience. But, you know, 1 or 2 might help liven it up a little bit. And there were parts in the game that, if they were playable at all, should have been action sequences, but instead we're just clicking on things and making Marty follow them, which isn't interesting gameplay in any type of setting. I'm not asking you to betray your adventure game roots or anything like that, because adventure games have had action sequences for ages, and you've done a couple of games that weren't adventure games, so I get the sense, Telltale, that you're trying to branch out into some different styles of gameplay, so incorporate those together. Create something new, a new hybrid of gaming styles, if you can, and, you know, you've had driving sequences as far back as Sam and Max, so just a few fun things. I mean, this isn't a high concern of mine, but some action sequences might help liven it up a little bit if you're really having trouble thinking of good puzzles that fit in the Back to the Future universe. And I'm not asking you to make it an action game. I'm certainly not asking you to make it an open world Grand Theft Auto clone. But 1 or 2 sequences that are more than just click over here. Now Marty will run over there. Because if that's all you're going to do, those might as well be cutscenes. 3. Tom Wilson. I know, you tried to get in touch with him and you couldn't get through to him, but I remember hearing you were having the same trouble getting through to Claudia Wells, and she approached you, and you managed to work that all out, and I can't remember the specifics, but I remember a few other places where actors were saying, yeah, well, they tried to get in touch with me, or they said they tried to get in touch with me, but couldn't. Telltale, I think there's something in your casting department that's not working, because if you're having this much trouble getting in touch with so many people, then you need to rethink your methods of getting in touch with them. But try again to get Tom Wilson for Season 2. Nothing against Kid Beyond. I like Kid Beyond, but he certainly doesn't carry the Biff role the same way Tom Wilson does. And Tom, if you're watching this, because I know you watch my blog. You don't watch my blog, but I'm going to say this to you anyway. I know that you don't like being typecast as Biff Tannen. I know Back to the Future is in your past and you like to move on. But please do this for us. Your performance in those movies is part of what makes them the comedy classics that they are. And you would bring so much to a Back to the Future game. And again, we've established that this is better than the animated series, and you returned for that. So Telltale and Tom, please get together and work something out, because it's not quite a Tannen unless it's Tom Wilson. 4, a bit more diversity in time periods. The 30s were fun. I liked spending time in the 30s, and I liked the alternate 1985s that we got. But I want to see more. Show us the 90s. Show us what's the future to Marty, but the past to us. Let us see him as a fish out of water in the other direction, but where we can still recognize both the fish and the water, so to speak, if that makes any sense. Show us more with the Brown family. Show us the Von Brauns first arriving in America. Give us more of Hill Valley's history, more of the family's history. Show us a time before Hill Valley was built. Show us what was going on in this part of the desert before that. Give us access to more time periods, because I enjoyed the 30s and I'm glad we got one solid story in the 30s, but I'd love to see more and more eras, just to see more of the history of Hill Valley, more of the history of the McFly, Tannen, and Brown families. Yeah, and I'd like to see a side of Hill Valley that we've never seen before. 5. Kisses with history, to use the term that Donald Belisario used on the set of Quantum Leap. You know what I'm talking about. Marty playing Johnny Be Good at the school dance, throwing the Frisbee pie tin. Give us more of Marty using his knowledge of the present in the setting of the past, and incorporate it into the gameplay. Give us a prop from whatever era the game is set in that Marty has to use as some device from the 80s. And again, don't just have Marty say, hey, this looks kind of like a Rubik's Cube. Have us have to figure out on our own how we're supposed to use this device to solve the puzzle based on knowledge of the 80s. Certainly you can foreshadow it, but don't give us the puzzle answers before we get to the puzzles, and incorporate that, because that's the one staple of the trilogy that I didn't really feel like you ever quite covered. So those are just a few things I'd like from Season 2 of Back to the Future. But you know what? Even if you don't do any of those, even if the gameplay still is lousy, as long as you keep up a good Marty and Doc story, a story that works for the characters, works for the franchise, and is funny and touching and scary at places, I'll be right there for Season 2, because I had my issues with Season 1, but overall I enjoyed it. It made me really happy. I was glad to see a new Back to the Future story, no matter what the medium, and I was glad to see a good Back to the Future story. So, thank you so much to everyone involved, to the entire team at Telltale, to AJ Locascio, to Bob Gale, Christopher Lloyd, Claudia Wells, everyone who came from the movies, all the new cast members who weren't involved in the movies. You all basically did a great job. The writers, the designers, the animators, the game had its problems, and I really hope you fix some of the glitches up before the DVD release, but it was wonderful to return to Hill Valley, and Telltale, you gave me a much better Back to the Future experience than I can imagine any other game developer doing. So maybe you could work with another game developer to do the actual gameplay part, and you just handle the overall story and everything. I don't know. I still love you, Telltale. I have your DVDs on my shelf with pride. I can never thank you enough for Sam and Max, for Tales of Monkey Island, and I can never thank you enough for the parts I liked about Back to the Future, which, again, was most of the experience. So, thank you so much, and if you're really coming out with Back to the Future Season 2, I will be there on the first day of pre-orders.